All right, so we're diving deep into this stack of CIA stuff you've got for us. History, how it works, crazy stories, all that.
Yeah.
We're going to try to cut through the noise and really figure out how this agency actually operates.
Right.
I'm betting you didn't just pick these sources randomly, right?
Definitely not new.
You've got some thoughts about the CIA already, don't you?
Well, it's easy to get caught up in, the movies and everything, the Hollywood version of spying, but the real CIA,
Sure.
with all the wins and losses, it's even more interesting once you dig in.
Yeah, no, totally. And every good, spy agency has to have a good origin story, right?
Right.
I have to admit, when I think early CIA, I immediately go to, shadowy dudes in trench coats,
Yeah.
probably in some smoky room trading secrets.
Of course, of course. What we've got in these sources, though, it's saying that the CIA actually comes from this group, the OSS,
Right.
the Office of Strategic Services,
Yeah.
back in World War II. And their early stuff, it was anything but subtle. Think disrupting Nazi operations, sometimes literally right behind enemy lines.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Right. The OSS, talk about pressure, right?
absolutely.
Trying to outmaneuver the Nazis, that's a lot to handle.
Yeah. After Pearl Harbor, no one wanted that intelligence failure again.
Right.
Things had to be centralized. So that's how we got the National Security Act of 1947.
Okay.
That's basically the CIA's birth certificate right there. Officially an agency now.
They're born out of necessity, basically.
Mhm.
But it wasn't all, cloak and dagger from day one.
You're right. First, it was a lot of gathering intel, making sense of it, and giving those insights to whoever needed them, especially with the whole Cold War thing heating up.
Right, right.
But then things shifted, with Directive 10-half in 48.
Directive 10 how? Okay, now that was a big shift, wasn't it? I mean, going from just analyzing stuff to actually getting their hands dirty with covert action.
Yeah, car. Yeah, huge escalation. They were authorized to basically do whatever it took to influence things in other countries. It was all about countering the Soviets, even if it meant, well, let's just say not always playing by the rules.
Right, right. And running those, let's call them not so by the book operations, that was the Office of Policy Coordination, right? The OPC.
The OPC, yeah. Talk about a secret within a secret. This OPC, I mean, they were a branch doing covert ops within an already covert agency. Yeah, very few people even knew the OPC existed. They were behind some of the CIA's most, let's say, daring missions, especially during those early Cold War years. It really shows how far they were willing to go to fight communism.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got the CIA up and running. They can do covert ops. But like any new group, I'm guessing there were some growing pains.
Oh, yeah, you could say that. Korea, that was a real eye-opener for the CIA early on.
Really?
Yeah, they had 200 officers. They're stationed in Seoul,
Yeah.
and their intel was, well, surprisingly bad.
Wait, seriously, 200 officers and they couldn't figure things out. What went wrong?
Big thing, they just didn't get the culture, Our sources say hardly any of them actually spoke Korean. They were relying on translators, secondhand info, that whole mess.
Man, so much for having boots on the ground if you can't even understand what you're hearing, right? Seems like that would be rule number one, especially in a war zone.
Exactly, and it just goes to show how tricky humite can be, human intelligence.
All right.
Finding good sources, trusting what they tell you, navigating all the cultural stuff. It's not like the movies make it out to be, that's for sure.
It's not all, cool gadgets and code breaking.
Right.
But those early hiccups, they didn't exactly stop the CIA from doing more covert stuff, did they? It seems like the 50s, that's when things got, well, bolder.
Yeah, the stakes were way higher then. Fear of communism spreading, that was huge. So you get interventions in Iran, Guatemala, stuff like Operation Ajax and Operation PB Success. Even the names sound like, spy movie stuff.
Operation Ajax, PB Success. All right, so we're not just talking about gathering intel anymore, are we? This is full-on meddling in other countries' business.
Yeah, it was a big jump in involvement for sure. Both those ops, they were all about regime change. The thinking was it's better to have a leader who's pro-West, even if it means, pushing out the guy who was actually elected.
So let's break these down one by one, starting with Iran. It's 1951, Cold War tension is off the charts.
Okay.
What's going on in Iran that makes the CIA interested?
Well, Iran's in a bit of turmoil, politically speaking. Mohammad Mossadegh, super charismatic guy, really popular. He gets elected prime minister. Big thing with him, he wanted what was best for Iran, first and foremost.
That sounds reasonable enough. So why was he in the CIA's crosshairs?
Well, he decided to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company.
Ah, okay, there it is, oil.
Yeah.
Figures.
Right, but this company, it was mostly controlled by the British at the time.
So not exactly a move that sat well with the West, I'm guessing.
Not at all. Plus, this is prime Cold War time, right?
Right. Yeah.
So the U.S., the Eisenhower administration specifically saw this as a threat, like Mossadegh might cozy up to the Soviets.
Right. The domino effect. Can't let Iran fall to communism. So the CIA steps in. Operation Ajax is a go. And leading the charge is Kermit Roosevelt Jr., Teddy Roosevelt's own grandson. Talk about a family business, huh?
Yeah. Kermit Roosevelt Jr., fascinating guy, really experienced intelligence officer. His mission, undermine Mossadegh by any means necessary. Propaganda, bribes, even stirring up unrest. It got messy.
And they actually succeeded. I mean, toppling a democratically elected leader, that seems, I don't know, risky, even for the CIA.
It was a gamble, for sure, but it worked, at least for a while. Mossadegh was arrested. The Shah, who was much friendlier to the West, he was back in power.
But I imagine there's some serious fallout from that, right? You can't just interfere in a country's elections and expect everything to be hunky-dory.
You're absolutely right. Operation Ajax, it came back to bite them big time. The Shah, his rule, it got more and more brutal. Eventually, you have the Iranian Revolution in '79.
Wow. Really makes you think about those unintended consequences, huh?
Yeah. It's a cautionary tale. And unfortunately, the CIA's meddling in Guatemala, Operation PB Success, it followed a similar and ultimately tragic path.
Right, Guatemala. Set the scene for us. What's the situation there?
So, 1951, Jacobo Arbenz wins the election in Guatemala, becomes president. Like Mossadegh, he's all about reform, putting his country first. He starts enacting these land reforms, and, well, they ruffle some feathers, mainly with the United Fruit Company.
United Fruit Company, that's an American corporation, right?
Right, and they owned a ton of land in Guatemala.
So we've got another case of a leader's policies clashing with powerful Western interests.
Exactly. And United Fruit, they had the ear of the Eisenhower administration. They pushed this narrative that Arbenz was a communist threat, even though he was all about democracy.
And were those claims true, or was this another case of, like, Cold War paranoia?
Well, Arbenz, yeah, he leaned left, but his main focus was land reform, improving life for everyday Guatemalans. But you know, back then, even a whiff of socialist ideas, that was enough to freak out Washington.
So the stage is set for another CIA intervention. Tell us about Operation PB Success. How'd that go down?
Well, it almost fell apart before it even began. One of the CIA guys, he actually left the plans for the coup in his hotel room in Guatemala City.
You're kidding.
Luckily for them, they got it back before, it was too late.
Wow. Talk about a close call. A covert operation nearly sunk by a misplaced document. I'm amazed they even went through with it after that.
Yeah, but they did. Alan Dulles was running the CIA at the time, and they went ahead with it. Trained and armed a small force led by Carlos Castillo Armas. He was a Guatemalan military officer. Not a fan of Arbenz, to say the least.
Another coup.
Yeah.
And how'd that turn out?
Unfortunately, it worked. Castillo Armas overthrew Arbenz, and Guatemala went through decades of military rule, civil war, the whole 9 yards. Just another example of those Cold War interventions. Good intentions, maybe, but devastating consequences in the long run.
It's crazy how these covert ops, right?
Yeah.
Like, they were all about Cold War fears and whatnot, but then they end up shaping these countries for years, decades even.
Right.
But were people back home, like, were they cool with all this? Did anyone ever question what the CIA was doing, how they were doing it?
Oh, there were definitely critics, but it took a huge scandal to really shake things up, and that, of course, was Watergate.
Right, Watergate.
Yeah.
But that wasn't just about Nixon and, like, the whole break-in thing, was it? It pulled back the curtain on some of the CIA's, let's say, less savory activities,
Yeah.
right? Stuff they were doing here in the U.S.
Exactly. Watergate. It blew the lid off. Operation CAOS. The CIA was spying on anti-war groups, American citizens, collecting files on them, way outside what they were supposed to be doing.
Wow, spying on their own people. You'd think that would have been a step too far, even during the Cold War. What happened? Did Congress do anything about that?
Oh, yeah, huge backlash. Congress, they started investigations, the big one being the Church Committee hearings. That's when all this classified stuff about the CIA came out, stuff they did here, stuff they did overseas. It was not pretty. They called it the family jewels, all those revelations.
Family jewels. Even the name sounds like, I don't know, a treasure chest full of dirty secrets.
Yeah, pretty much.
What kind of things we're talking about here?
Assassination plots, trying to topple governments, illegal surveillance, even dabbling in mind control experiments. It really made people question, like, who's watching the watchers,
Right.
What are the limits of spying, and is the CIA crossing those lines?
Wow, assassination plots. Mind control. That sounds like we've gone from spy movies to, like, full-on sci-fi. But seriously, all that coming to light, that had to be a turning point for the CIA.
Oh, absolutely. Congress stepped in, put their foot down, way stricter oversight from then on. The CIA, their power to do covert ops, it got cut way back, and they actually had to report what they were doing to congressional intelligence committees.
Talk about accountability, huh? Hard to imagine the early CIA operating under that kind of microscope. But while this is going on, the world's changing too. Cold War ends, new threats pop up. How'd the CIA handle that shift?
Big realization was they weren't the only game in town anymore. You had the NSA, DIA, all these other agencies growing, vying for influence, resources, the whole deal.
So from one agency to a whole, community of intelligence agencies, that must have led to some turf wars.
Okay.
You could say that. Competition was fierce. It became clear they needed to get on the same page, work together better. That's how we got the 2004 Intelligence Reform Act. That's where the Director of National Intelligence comes in, the DNI.
Right, the DNI, basically the head honcho of all things intelligence, right?
No.
What did that change?
Big time. DNI's job was to oversee all 16 intelligence agencies, including the CIA, make sure everyone's working together, no more silos. It was a huge power shift.
So the CIA went from being like this independent operator to just one part of a much bigger machine.
Yeah.
But how they got intel was changing too, wasn't it? The internet explodes, information is everywhere now.
Exactly. Suddenly, open source intelligence, OSINT, that's the big thing. It's not about sneaking around anymore. It's about sifting through mountains of data online, figuring out what's real, what's not, connecting the dots in the digital world. Whole different ballgame.
So the CIA had to become digital detectives on top of everything else. But were those classic covert ops, boots on the ground stuff, did that go away completely?
That's interesting. OSINT was huge, yeah. But the CIA also started relying more and more on private contractors. For certain jobs, some of those riskier ones, covert stuff included.
Contractors, that sounds, I don't know, a little shady. What about accountability, transparency, all that?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? Using private companies for intelligence work, that's a whole debate in itself. Less oversight, just potential conflicts of interest. And then there's the whole can of worms about the ethics of it all, legality. It gets murky fast.
Sounds like we need another deep dive to unpack that one. But for now, we've covered a lot. From the CIA's early days, post-World War II, all the way to the digital age. It's been a wild ride.
We've seen how the CIA, they've been shaped by global events, political pressures, tech, the whole shebang. It just goes to show, even the most secretive organizations, they can't escape history.
Absolutely. And it actually leads us to our final thought for today. As we head deeper into the 21st century, with all the tech evolving at warp speed and the world getting more complex by the day, what's next for the CIA? Can they adapt, evolve with the times, or will they end up as some relic of the past? Something to chew on as you do your own deep dive into the world of spies and secrets. Thanks for joining us.